My daughter and brother completely abandoned me in a substandard care facility after a horrific car crash, plotting to steal my inheritance. So I used my architectural skills to silently construct an impenetrable legal trap they never saw coming. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The persistent, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only anchor tethering me to reality. For days, or perhaps weeks, the concept of time had completely dissolved. That mechanical chirp was the soundtrack to a haze of agonizing pain and heavily medicated sleep. When I finally forced my heavy eyelids open, the harsh, flickering fluorescent light above me felt like a physical assault. I was not in the state-of-the-art rehabilitation wing of the city hospital, where they had first rushed me after the semi-truck crossed the median and crushed my sedan. I remembered the initial aftermath. The screech of metal, the shattering glass, the absolute certainty that my life as a 58-year-old architect was ending right there on the rainy asphalt. I remembered waking up briefly in a pristine ICU, surrounded by high-tech machinery and murmuring specialists. But this room was different. It smelled intensely of bleach attempting, and failing, to mask the underlying odor of stale food and neglect. The walls were painted a nauseating shade of institutional beige, peeling at the corners. A water stain bloomed across the ceiling tiles directly above my bed, a brownish-yellow shape that my architect's brain automatically tried to analyze for structural compromise. My body felt entirely alien to me. Every breath was a negotiation with my fractured ribs. My right leg was encased in a heavy, rigid cast, elevated and throbbing with a dull, constant ache. My dominant arm, the hand that had sketched blueprints for award-winning civic centers and sprawling residential complexes, was wrapped in thick bandages, a spiderweb of IV lines snaking into the back of my hand. I pressed the call button, my thumb weak and trembling. It took 23 minutes by the clock on the wall for a nurse to arrive. She looked exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled, carrying a clipboard that seemed too heavy for her. "Oh, you're finally awake, Camilla," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, merely stating a fact. She didn't check my vitals or adjust my pillows. She just stood at the foot of the bed, scribbling something down. Where is my daughter?" I rasped. My throat felt like it was coated in sandpaper. "Where is Sylvia?" The nurse sighed, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Honey, you've been at Shady Pines Recovery for 12 days. You were transferred from the main hospital when your insurance wouldn't cover the premium rehab center anymore. Your family authorized the move." My family. Panic began to claw at the edges of my heavily medicated mind, fighting through the fog of the painkillers. Sylvia, my brother Michael. The nurse flipped a page on her clipboard, not making eye contact. "We haven't had any visitors log in for you since you arrived. There was a phone call from a Michael about a week ago, asking if you were conscious yet. When I said no, he said he'd call back. He hasn't." The words hung in the stagnant air of the room. 12 days. I had been lying in this crumbling, forgotten facility for almost 2 weeks, and neither my 28-year-old daughter, whom I loved more than life itself, nor my older brother had come to sit by my side. Can you dial her number for me?" I begged, the humiliation of pleading entirely overshadowed by my desperate need to hear Sylvia's voice. I rattled off the number from memory. The nurse reluctantly pulled a cordless phone from her pocket, dialed, and held it to my ear. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I asked the nurse to try Michael's number. It rang once and then went straight to a generic, automated greeting. I lay there as the nurse left the room, the silence pressing down on me heavier than the plaster on my leg. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed up with Sylvia when she was a child, battling fevers and night terrors. I thought of the massive financial sacrifices I had made to ensure she attended the best private schools and graduated from university debt-free. I had built my entire life, my entire career, around providing a foundation for her. And now, when the structure of my own life had violently collapsed, she was nowhere to be found. The physical agony radiating from my shattered bones was blinding, but the agonizing realization of their abandonment was far more profound. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The following days bled into a miserable continuum of physical therapy that felt more like torture, terrible meals delivered on plastic trays, and an echoing, profound loneliness. My mind, however, began to clear. As the heavy painkillers were stepped down to more manageable doses, the sharp, analytical architect within me began to wake up. I started studying the facility. Shady Pines was a place where people were sent to fade away quietly. It was cheap, understaffed, and completely hidden from the affluent circles my family usually ran in. It was on the 18th day that Sylvia finally appeared. The door to my room pushed open, and she stepped in. She looked immaculate. Her hair was perfectly blown out, and she was wearing a designer trench coat I recognized. I had bought it for her 25th birthday. She stopped just inside the doorway, her nose wrinkling visibly as she took in the scent of the room. She didn't rush to my side. She didn't cry. She just stood there, looking at me as if I were a stranger she was forced to interact with out of polite obligation. "Mom," she said, her voice tight, strained, "you look terrible." "I survived a head-on collision with a truck, Sylvia," I managed to say, my voice stronger now than it had been days ago, though still raspy. "Where have you been? Why am I in this place?" Sylvia crossed her arms, taking a cautious step further into the room, making sure not to brush against the stained privacy curtain. "It's been incredibly stressful, Mom. You have no idea. The doctors at the main hospital said your recovery would take months, maybe a year. They said you might never walk properly again or use your right hand. We had to make practical decisions. The insurance wouldn't cover the luxury place indefinitely. So you dumped me here." The betrayal tasted like ash in my mouth. "Don't be dramatic," she sighed, checking the glowing screen of her smartwatch. "Uncle Michael stepped in to help. He said this place was cost-effective and would keep your estate from bleeding dry with medical bills. You know how he is about finances. He's an independent wealth consultant, Mom. He knows what he's doing." I closed my eyes for a moment, the puzzle pieces snapping together with sickening clarity. My estate, my life savings, the properties, the investments I had carefully curated over a 30-year career. "I'm awake now, Sylvia," I said, opening my eyes and fixing her with a hard stare. "I can make my own decisions. I want to be transferred. Call my lawyer, Alice, or tell me where my phone is." Sylvia shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "Mom, your phone was destroyed in the crash. And as for making decisions, Uncle Michael and I have been talking. The doctors were very pessimistic about your cognitive recovery after the concussion. Michael is looking into getting a medical power of attorney, just temporarily, just to make sure the bills get paid and your portfolio doesn't crash while you're incapacitated." She wasn't looking at me like I was her mother. She was looking at me like I was a problem to be managed, a stepping stone she was waiting to walk over. The coldness in her eyes was terrifying. She stayed for exactly 12 minutes, mostly complaining about how difficult the traffic was getting to this side of town, before making her excuses and leaving. She didn't hug me. She barely touched my uninjured shoulder. As the door clicked shut behind her, a profound shift occurred within me. The crushing despair I had felt over the last 2 weeks crystallized into something entirely different. It solidified into a cold, hard resolve. They thought I was broken. They thought I was a fading old woman, trapped in a decaying body in a decaying building, entirely at their mercy. They thought they had secured their financial futures by leaving me in the dark. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten that I spent my entire life designing structures meant to withstand immense pressure. I knew how to build a foundation, and more importantly, I knew how to demolish one without collateral damage. They were assessing the surface, looking only at the bandages and the cheap room. They had forgotten one crucial thing. The vast majority of my late husband's wealth wasn't in my standard portfolio at all. It was locked in an airtight, invisible trust that only I controlled, a fact I had kept entirely to myself for 15 years. To understand the depth of my brother Michael's entitlement, you have to understand the dynamic of our youth. Our parents were hardworking, but strictly middle class. When I discovered a passion for design and mathematics, I worked 3 jobs to put myself through architectural school. Michael, 4 years my senior, discovered a passion for convincing other people to give him money for surefire ventures that inevitably collapsed. Over the decades, as I built my firm from the ground up, landing municipal contracts and winning design awards, Michael styled himself as an independent wealth consultant. It was a title that sounded impressive at dinner parties, but ultimately meant he spent his days golfing with rich widows and trying to skim commissions off dubious investment advice. I had bylaid him out more times than I could count, paying off a silent partner when a restaurant venture failed, covering his mortgage when the market dipped. I did it because he was family and because I naively believed he would eventually find his footing. I was wrong. My generosity hadn't helped him. It had only subsidized his arrogance and fueled his resentment of my success. 2 days after Sylvia's brief, chilling visit, Michael finally graced me with his presence. He didn't walk into the room, he made an entrance. He was wearing a bespoke, charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than a month's stay at this miserable facility. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. But as he stepped closer to the bed, the heavy scent of expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the faint, sharp smell of scotch on his breath, even at 2 in the afternoon. It was the smell of desperation trying to masquerade as success. "Camilla, my dear," he said smoothly, flashing a practiced, brilliant smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He pulled the single, uncomfortable plastic visitor's chair closer to the bed and sat down, carefully adjusting his trousers so they wouldn't crease. "Look at you. It's an absolute tragedy. What happened? A tragedy." "You took your time getting here, Michael," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I didn't want him to see the anger. I wanted him to see compliance. I needed to see his hand before I played mine. He waved a hand dismissively, his heavy gold watch catching the terrible fluorescent light. "I've been working around the clock on your behalf, Camilla. You have no idea the absolute mess your affairs were in. With you completely out of commission, and let's be honest, the doctors weren't sure you'd ever regain full cognitive function. Someone had to step up to protect the family assets. To protect Sylvia." "Protect them from what?" I asked quietly. "From stagnation, Camilla, from medical leeches," he leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Your standard investment portfolio is far too conservative, and with these hospital bills, well, we needed to make some aggressive moves. I've been advising Sylvia on how to restructure some of your liquid assets, but we're hitting roadblocks because of your name on the accounts." He paused, reaching into his perfectly tailored leather briefcase and pulling out a thick manila envelope. He laid it gently on the edge of my bed, right next to my uninjured hand. "That's why I had my legal team draft these," he continued, his tone shifting into the smooth cadence of a salesman closing a deal. "It's a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. It gives me the authority to manage your estate, sell off the underperforming properties, like that absurd lake house you never use, and ensure that Sylvia's inheritance is protected and grown while you focus entirely on your recovery." He looked around the dismal room, his lip curling slightly. "And we can eventually get you moved somewhere a bit more comfortable, once the finances are properly secured under my management." I looked at the envelope. I didn't need to read the documents to know what they said. It was a complete surrender. If I signed it, he would liquidate my life's work within a month, funneling the money into his own failing schemes or offshore accounts to cover his hidden debts, leaving Sylvia with crumbs and me to rot in shady pines indefinitely. He was exploiting my daughter's anxiety and my physical vulnerability to orchestrate the ultimate theft. "I'm very tired, Michael," I said softly, letting my eyes droop slightly, playing the part of the exhausted, defeated victim perfectly. "My hand, the bandages, I can't hold a pen today. Leave them. I'll look at them when my vision isn't so blurry." Michael frowned slightly, a flash of genuine irritation crossing his polished features. He hated delays. He needed this done quickly. But he quickly smoothed his expression back into a mask of brotherly concern. "Of course, Camilla, take your time, but don't take too long. The market waits for no one, and we need to secure your future. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. I'll be back on Friday. Try to rest. As he walked out the door, the click of his expensive Italian leather shoes echoing in the cheap linoleum hallway, I reached over with my clumsy, bandaged left hand and pushed the manila envelope off the bed. It hit the floor with a satisfying thud. The game had officially begun. They thought they were playing a crippled old woman. They didn't realize they were playing an architect who had just found the structural flaw in their entire scheme. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to begin drafting the blueprints for their absolute ruin. The moment the door clicked shut behind my brother, the clock started ticking. I had allowed Michael and Sylvia to believe they held all the cards, but they were playing a game of checkers while I was drafting a three-dimensional blueprint for their destruction. To execute it, however, I needed tools. Specifically, I needed a line of communication to the outside world that didn't go through the rusted, monitored switchboard of Shady Pines. That evening, during the shift change, a young nursing assistant named Matteo came in to empty my trash. He was one of the few staff members who actually looked me in the eye, and I had noticed him admiring the heavy gold and sapphire ring I still wore on my uninjured left hand, a piece Michael had miraculously failed to pry off my finger. "Matteo," I whispered, my voice rough but steady. "I need a favor, a massive favor, and I am willing to compensate you very, very well for it." He paused, looking nervously at the open doorway. "Ma'am, I'm not supposed to." "I need your cell phone," I interrupted, slipping the heavy sapphire ring off my finger and holding it out to him in the dim light. "For 10 minutes. You take this. You pawn it, you keep it, I don't care. It's worth at least $5,000. Just let me make one phone call and bring me a cheap burner phone tomorrow." "Do we have a deal?" Matteo swallowed hard, his eyes wide. He took the ring, slipped it into his scrub pocket, and handed me his unlocked smartphone. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Sylvia. I dialed the private, unlisted cell phone number of Alice, my personal corporate attorney. Alice was a shark in a tailored suit, a woman who had helped me navigate the ruthless world of commercial real estate for 2 decades. She was fiercely loyal, terrifyingly competent, and she had absolutely no connection to Michael or his amateur legal contacts. "Camilla." Alice's voice crackled through the receiver, thick with shock. "My God, I've been trying to locate you for almost 3 weeks. Michael's lawyers stonewalled my office, claiming you were in a specialized, restricted brain injury clinic in another state. Where are you?" "I'm in a dumping ground on the east side called Shady Pines," I replied, my voice gaining strength with every word. "Alice, listen to me carefully. Michael is attempting a hostile takeover of my estate. He's pushing a durable power of attorney, claiming I'm cognitively compromised. He's using Sylvia as leverage." "I'll be there in 20 minutes with an injunction," Alice snarled, the protective fury evident in her tone. "No," I commanded sharply. "If you block him legally right now, he'll just slink away and try another angle. I don't just want to stop him, Alice. I want to obliterate him. I need you to come here tomorrow during visiting hours. Bring a notary, bring your secure laptop, and most importantly, bring the files for the Arthur Trust." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "The Arthur Trust," Alice repeated, her tone shifting to one of profound reverence. "You're finally opening the vault. When my husband, Arthur, passed away 15 years ago from a sudden heart attack, he left behind a staggering sum of money. Money he had quietly accumulated through early, incredibly lucrative tech investments that no one in my family, least of all Michael, knew about. To protect me from the inevitable vultures, Arthur and I had structured this wealth into a blind trust. On paper, my architectural firm and my standard investments made me wealthy, but the Arthur Trust made me a titan. I had never touched it, saving it as the ultimate safety net for Sylvia's future. Now, that safety net was going to become a steel trap. The next afternoon, Alice walked into Shady Pines disguised in a modest cardigan, carrying a leather tote bag that looked entirely unassuming. For 3 hours, while I pretended to be asleep whenever a nurse walked by, we worked. I instructed Alice to initiate a quiet, complete restructuring of my known, visible assets, the ones Michael was drooling over. We began the complex legal process of funneling 95% of my public portfolio into an irrevocable charitable foundation dedicated to funding female architecture students. When this is done, I explained, reviewing the digital documents on Alice's screen, my public estate will look exactly the same on the surface. The accounts will exist, the properties will still be in my name, but the foundation will hold the absolute, unshakable equity. If Michael gets his hands on the accounts, he'll find them functioning as ghost accounts, stripped of any actual withdrawal value. "It's brilliant," Alice murmured, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "It's a beautiful facade with absolutely nothing supporting it on the inside. But what about Michael himself? We need to know exactly why he's so desperate." "That brings us to step 2, I said, leaning back into my uncomfortable pillows, a grim satisfaction settling into my bones. "I need you to hire Parker." Parker was a private investigator our firm occasionally used to vet shady contractors. He was ex-military, deeply cynical, and incredibly thorough. "Put Parker on Michael immediately," I instructed. "I want a microscope on every single financial move my brother has made in the last 5 years. I want to know who he owes, how much he owes, and what kind of desperate lies he's been feeding my daughter to get her to go along with this. I want every cracked brick in his foundation exposed." Friday arrived with a suffocating, humid heat that made the cheap facility smell even worse. True to his word, Michael appeared precisely at 2 in the afternoon, but this time he had brought Sylvia with him. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Sylvia looked exhausted, dark circles bruised beneath her eyes, her posture defensive. Michael, conversely, looked almost giddy, holding a fresh, thicker manila envelope. "Camilla, my dear," Michael announced, practically gliding into the room. "I trust you're feeling more cooperative today. We really must get these administrative headaches out of the way. I've brought Sylvia so she can witness the signatures. We want everything to be perfectly transparent, don't we?" He laid the envelope on my lap, clicking a heavy, expensive fountain pen and offering it to me. "Just a few initials here, here, and here. Then you can go back to resting." I looked at the pen, then up at Sylvia. She was staring at the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Sylvia," I said gently, "look at me." She hesitated, then raised her eyes. They were swimming with unshed tears and a heavy, suffocating guilt. "Before I sign my life away," I said, keeping my gaze locked on my daughter, "I need to ask a question. Michael tells me my portfolio is underperforming. He tells me we need aggressive moves to protect your inheritance." I shifted my gaze to my brother, who was smiling tightly, the pen still extended in the air. "Tell me, Michael," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing all trace of the frail, injured woman I had been playing. "How exactly is the Oakwood Ridge development doing?" The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The blood entirely drained from Michael's face, leaving him looking like a polished wax figure. The Oakwood Ridge development was a massive, speculative commercial real estate venture that Michael had championed 3 years ago. I knew about it because Parker, working with terrifying speed, had sent a preliminary encrypted text to my burner phone that morning. Oakwood Ridge hadn't just failed. It had spectacularly collapsed under a mountain of federal investigations regarding misappropriated funds, a fact Michael had desperately kept out of the papers. I don't know what you're talking about," Michael stammered, his hand trembling slightly, the fountain pen shaking. "Oakwood it's a long-term hold. It's experiencing some standard regulatory delays, that's all." I turned back to Sylvia. Her head had snapped up at the mention of the name. "Sylvia," I said calmly, "did your uncle advise you to invest your entire company bonus into Oakwood Ridge last year? Did he tell you it was a guaranteed 8% quarterly yield?" Sylvia's breath hitched. She looked at Michael, her expression shifting from guilt to raw, sudden panic. "Uncle Michael, you told me that money was safe. You said the returns were already pending." "It is safe," Michael barked, his smooth veneer cracking completely. He turned on me, his eyes flashing with genuine malice. "What is this, Camilla? What kind of sick game are you playing? You're lying in a hospital bed, out of your mind on painkillers, and you're trying to poison my relationship with my niece. I'm not on painkillers anymore, Michael, I replied, sitting up slightly straighter, ignoring the searing pain in my ribs. I haven't been for 3 days. My mind is perfectly clear. Michael took a step toward the bed, his face twisted in an ugly, threatening sneer. He leaned down, his expensive cologne overwhelming my senses. You listen to me, you senile old bat, he hissed, his voice low enough that Sylvia, standing near the door, couldn't hear the exact words, but could clearly see the aggression. You are going to sign these papers, or I swear to God, I will have my lawyers petition the court to declare you legally incompetent. I will freeze every asset you have. I will cut off the payments to this miserable facility. And I will leave you here to rot as a ward of the state. You don't have the strength to fight me. He straightened up, smoothing his tie, forcing a smile back onto his face as he turned to Sylvia. Your mother is hallucinating, sweetheart, the trauma from the crash. It's causing severe paranoia. This is exactly why we need to take control. But Sylvia wasn't looking at him with blind trust anymore. The seed of doubt I had planted had instantly taken root. She looked at his panicked sweat, the shaking of his hands, and the sudden, vicious threat he had leveled at me. I'm not signing anything today, Michael, I said loudly, ensuring Sylvia heard every word. And if you ever threaten me again, I will make sure the next people asking you about Oakwood Ridge are wearing federal badges. Michael snatched the envelope off my lap, his face purple with rage. You'll regret this, Camilla. Come on, Sylvia, we're leaving. He stormed out of the room. Sylvia lingered for a fraction of a second, looking back at me. I didn't offer her comfort. I simply held her gaze. She needed to feel the weight of the situation. She turned and hurried after him, leaving the door wide open. The first strike had landed perfectly, and the structural integrity of Michael's lies was beginning to buckle. The weekend was agonizing, not just physically, but psychologically. I knew Michael was cornered, and cornered animals were dangerous. He immediately made good on his minor threats. The facility administrator visited my room on Monday morning, nervously informing me that the primary card on file for my medical expenses had been suspended, and if alternate payment wasn't provided within 48 hours, I would be discharged to a state-run shelter. Michael was trying to starve me out. I simply smiled, asked to borrow her office phone, and had Alice wire $100,000 directly to the facility's operating account, prepaying for a month in their premium private suite, which I immediately demanded to be transferred to. The look on the administrator's face was worth every penny. On Tuesday afternoon, Alice arrived at my new, significantly cleaner room. She wasn't disguised this time. She walked in wearing her sharpest court suit, carrying a thick, heavy accordion file that practically hummed with lethal information. Parker outdid himself, Alice said, dropping the massive dossier onto my bedside table with a heavy thud. Michael isn't just in debt, Camilla. He is running a textbook Ponzi scheme, and it is in the final stages of a catastrophic collapse. For the next 2 hours, we went through the documents. It was worse than I could have ever imagined. Michael owed millions to private, unsavory lenders. He had mortgaged his own home 3 times over. He had drained the accounts of his elderly clients. And most devastatingly, Parker had found the records of Sylvia's finances. He's been managing her savings account since she graduated, right? Alice asked softly, pulling out a highlighted bank statement. I nodded, feeling a cold, dread pool in my stomach. Yes, she trusted him. It's gone, Camilla, Alice said, pointing to the bottom line. He didn't just lose her Oakwood investment. Over the last 14 months, he has systematically drained her primary savings, forging her digital signature on withdrawal authorizations to cover his own margin calls. Her balance is currently $34. Tears pricked my eyes, not for me, but for my daughter. She had worked so hard, and her own uncle had financially gutted her while she slept. We have him, I said, my voice trembling with a terrifying, absolute rage. We have everything we need. The very next day, Sylvia came to visit me alone. She looked fundamentally broken. The polished, impatient young woman who had visited me weeks ago was gone. She walked into my new suite, looking confused by the upgraded surroundings, and collapsed into the armchair next to my bed. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, deep, racking gasps of pure despair. "Mom," she choked out, unable to look at me. "Mom, I'm so sorry. You were right. You were right about everything." I reached out with my left hand, placing it gently on her trembling shoulder. "What happened, Sylvia?" "He asked me for my credit cards," she sobbed, looking up at me with mascara-streaked cheeks. "He came to my apartment last night, completely panicked. He said the lawyers needed an immediate retainer to fight you in court for the power of attorney, and his liquid assets were temporarily frozen. He demanded my cards, when I told him to just use my savings account that he manages. He lost his mind. He started screaming at me, calling me ungrateful, saying I owed him for taking care of this whole mess." She wiped her eyes, taking a shuddering breath. "I went to the bank this morning, Mom, to check the account. It's empty. He took everything. My emergency fund, my down payment savings, all of it. And when I confronted him, he told me that if I didn't help him force you to sign the estate over to him by this weekend, we were both going to be ruined." I didn't yell. I didn't say, "I told you so." The punishment of her own realization was brutal enough. Instead, I picked up the thick dossier Alice had left and placed it squarely on Sylvia's lap. "Open it to page 4, I commanded softly. Sylvia wiped her hands on her jeans and opened the heavy cover. She stared at the highlighted documents, her eyes scanning the forensic accounting Parker had compiled. She saw the forged signatures. She saw the wire transfers from her account directly to offshore holding companies under Michael's name. She saw the foreclosure notices on his properties. I watched the last remnants of her allegiance to her uncle shatter into a million pieces. The illusion was dead. "He's a monster," she whispered, her voice devoid of everything but shock. "He's been lying to me for years. He isolated you here. He told me you were basically a vegetable, just so he could steal your money to cover his crimes. And I let him. I abandoned you." She fell to her knees beside my bed, burying her head against my mattress, crying so hard she was shaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Please, Mom, please." I stroked her hair, feeling a complex knot of grief and fierce, protective love tighten in my chest. The manipulation was broken. She was finally mine again. "We are going to fix this, Sylvia," I said, my voice as hard and precise as cut glass. "Michael has called a family dinner this Saturday at the country club to celebrate my recovery and force the signing of the papers in public, where he thinks I won't cause a scene. I want you to tell him that I have agreed to sign everything." Sylvia looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "What? No, Mom, you can't." "I'm not going to sign a thing," I smiled, a cold, ruthless expression that made Sylvia pause. "But we are going to that dinner. And we are going to give your uncle exactly the kind of public spectacle he deserves. We are going to let him think he's one, right up until the moment we tear his entire life down." Saturday evening arrived with a cool, crisp breeze that felt like a mockery of the storm that was about to break. I insisted on arriving at the Oak Creek Country Club in a medical transport van, completing the illusion by having the driver wheel me into the private dining room in a bulky, institutional wheelchair. I wore a simple, loose-fitting dress that Sylvia had brought me, my arm still heavily bandaged, a soft, woolen shawl draped over my shoulders. I looked exactly as Michael expected me to look, fragile, diminished, and completely defeated. The private dining room was suffocatingly opulent, all dark mahogany paneling, crystal chandeliers, and the heavy scent of roasted meat and expensive wine. Michael had spared no expense, likely putting the entire evening on one of his few remaining, severely over-leveraged credit cards. He hadn't just invited Sylvia and me. He had invited 6 of his top-tier clients, wealthy, elderly individuals who were, unbeknownst to them, the unwitting foundational blocks of his collapsing Ponzi scheme. He was using my supposed capitulation as a performance piece to reassure his anxious investors of his financial stability and family loyalty. Ah, there she is. Michael boomed as the waiter wheeled me to the head of the table. He rushed over, his smile blinding, and kissed my cheek. I had to force myself not to recoil from the smell of his scotch-laced breath. "Camilla, darling, you look stronger tonight. So brave of you to join us." "I wouldn't miss it, Michael," I said softly, keeping my eyes downcast. Sylvia sat to my right, rigid as a board, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. She wouldn't look at Michael. She wouldn't look at anyone. Dinner was an agonizing affair. I picked at my food, listening as Michael held court, spinning elaborate, hollow tales about market trends and upcoming opportunities. He continually referenced his family's legacy and how my unfortunate accident had only strengthened our familial bonds. The elderly investors nodded along, charmed by his slick veneer, completely blind to the rot beneath the floorboards. As the plates were cleared and the waiters poured coffee, Michael stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal water glass. The room fell silent. "My dear friends," Michael began, placing a hand over his heart, his voice dripping with rehearsed emotion. "Tonight is a celebration of resilience. As you know, my brilliant sister Camilla suffered a terrible tragedy a few weeks ago. It has been a dark time for our family, but adversity reveals our true strength." He gestured toward me, a look of faux pity plastered on his face. "Camilla's road to recovery will be long, and she requires absolute peace. That is why, tonight, we are formalizing an arrangement. To ensure her legacy and her daughter's future are protected, Camilla has graciously agreed to grant me full medical and financial power of attorney, consolidating our family's assets under my firm's management." A polite smattering of applause broke out around the table. The investors smiled approvingly at his supposed brotherly devotion. Michael reached down beside his chair and produced a familiar, thick leather portfolio. He unzipped it and pulled out the legal documents, placing them directly in front of me on the white tablecloth. Beside the documents, he placed a heavy, gold-plated pen. "Camilla," he said, his voice lowering to a gentle, coaxing tone designed purely for the audience. "Whenever you are ready, my dear." I stared at the pen. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The polite smiles around the table began to falter. Michael's eye twitched. Then I pushed the wheelchair back from the table. I placed my uninjured hand on the edge of the heavy mahogany wood. I engaged my core, ignoring the sharp protest of my healing ribs, and pushed myself up. I stood, entirely unassisted, towering over the wheelchair, my posture as straight and unyielding as a steel beam. A collective gasp echoed through the room. One of the elderly women dropped her coffee spoon. Michael took a step back, his eyes widening in absolute horror. "Camilla," he stammered, his polished voice cracking. What are you doing? Sit down, you're not well." "I am perfectly well, Michael," I said, my voice ringing out clear, sharp, and authoritative, commanding the room with the same tone I used to command boardrooms. "My ribs are healing. My leg is mending, but more importantly, my mind has never been clearer." I picked up the gold-plated pen, examined it for a brief second, and tossed it casually over my shoulder. It clattered uselessly against the hardwood floor. "There will be no signing tonight," I announced to the stunned table. In fact, the only document I have signed this week was a directive to my corporate attorneys, transferring 95% of my visible assets into an irrevocable charitable trust. Michael's face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and realized he couldn't fly. You can't have done that, the accounts." "The accounts are empty shells, Michael," I smiled, a predator showing its teeth, "just like your entire life." Before he could respond, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open. Alice strode in, looking like an executioner in a tailored charcoal suit. She wasn't alone. Trailing behind her were 2 uniformed police officers, whom Alice had quietly coordinated with after Parker turned his findings over to the authorities. "What is the meaning of this?" Michael shouted, his panic finally breaking through his facade. He looked frantically at the officers, then at his investors. "This is a private dinner. Camilla, call off your attack dog." Alice ignored him. She walked directly to the table and dropped 6 heavy, thick manila folders onto the polished wood, one in front of each of the bewildered investors. "Ladies and gentlemen," I addressed the room, keeping my eyes locked on Michael's terrified face. "My brother invited you here tonight to prove his stability. I invited my attorney here to prove his insolvency. I urge you to open those folders." Inside, you will find a comprehensive forensic accounting of Michael's firm from the past 5 years. Hesitantly, the guests opened the folders. You'll see that the Oakwood Ridge development, which he heavily leveraged your funds for, is currently under federal investigation and completely bankrupt, I continued, my voice echoing off the paneled walls. You'll see that your monthly returns are actually just the principal investments of newer clients. He isn't managing your wealth, he's cannibalizing it. "Lies!" Michael screamed, spittle flying from his lips. He lunged toward the table, trying to snatch the folders away, but the 2 officers quickly stepped forward, placing themselves between him and the guests. "She's insane. She had a brain injury." "If I'm insane, Michael," I said coldly, "then explain page 12. Explain the offshore accounts. Explain the 3 mortgages on your house." The dining room descended into chaos. The elderly investors were gasping, flipping through the highlighted documents, their faces turning from confusion to profound, devastated rage. One man began to weep. Another stood up, pointing a trembling finger at Michael, calling him a thief. Through the shouting, Sylvia finally stood up. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of Michael, who was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he looked for an exit. "Sylvia, please," Michael begged, reaching a hand out to her. "You know me. You know I was just trying to help the family. Tell them." Sylvia reached into her purse and pulled out a single, crumpled piece of paper. It was the bank statement showing her balance of $34. She held it up right in front of his face. "You stole my future," Sylvia said, her voice eerily calm, possessing a quiet, devastating power. "You looked me in the eye, you used my fear for my mother, and you systematically gutted my life savings to cover your own pathetic failures. You are not my family. You are a parasite." She dropped the paper onto his chest. It fluttered to the floor. "I'm done with you," she said. She turned her back on him, walked over to me, and gently, protectively, took my uninjured arm. "Officers," Alice said crisply, stepping forward. "As per the warrant issued this afternoon regarding wire fraud and elder abuse, I believe you have a job to do." Michael didn't fight. The fight had been completely drained out of him. As the officer stepped forward and placed his wrists in handcuffs, reciting his rights over the din of the furious investors, he looked back at me one last time. There was no anger left in his eyes, only the hollow, terrified realization that he had built his house on sand, and I had just summoned the tide. The aftermath of that night at the Oak Creek Country Club was swift and utterly merciless. The moment the handcuffs clicked onto Michael's wrists, the illusion he had spent his entire life maintaining shattered beyond repair. By Monday morning, Parker's dossier had been fully processed by the state prosecutor's office. The SEC froze whatever pathetic remnants were left in Michael's corporate accounts. His bespoke suits and his mortgage to the Hilt luxury condo were seized. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse to avoid a lengthy, humiliating trial. He was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. I did not attend the sentencing. He had ceased to be a part of my architecture the moment he left me to rot in that substandard bed. My own recovery, however, was just beginning. The day after the dinner, I checked myself out of Shady Pines forever. Alice had arranged for my transfer to a private, beautifully designed rehabilitation facility, one with expansive windows, indoor gardens, and a staff that actually cared. Sylvia was there every single day. Our reconciliation was not immediate, nor was it simple. The betrayal she had participated in, however manipulated she was, had left deep, ragged scars on our relationship. We spent hours in the quiet sunroom of the new facility, having the difficult, agonizing conversations we had avoided for years. "I was so scared, Mom," she confessed one afternoon, holding a cup of tea, looking out at the manicured lawns. When they told me you might not recover, I panicked. I let Uncle Michael convince me that I wasn't strong enough to handle it, that I needed him to take the wheel. I was weak. You were manipulated, Sylvia. I corrected her gently, reaching out to cover her hand with mine. The bandages were finally off, revealing angry pink scars that would fade with time. But you also made a choice to look away. You chose the easy path of ignorance over the hard path of presence. I know, she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. And I have to live with that. I lost my savings, I almost lost you. I have to start completely over. Yes, you do, I agreed, my tone firm but loving. I am not going to magically refill your bank account, Sylvia. You need to learn how to build your own foundation, brick by brick, so that no one can ever knock it down again. But you will not do it alone. I am your mother. I will always be your mother. We are going to rebuild this. And we did. Sylvia moved out of her expensive downtown apartment and into a modest studio. She took a second job on weekends to rebuild her emergency fund. It was exhausting, humbling work, but I watched a new resilience forge within her, a steel core she hadn't possessed before. She visited me constantly, helping me with my physical therapy, learning to navigate the new, honest dynamic between us. 6 months later, my recovery was nearly complete. I still walked with a slight limp, relying on a sleek, carbon fiber cane, but the pain was manageable, and my mind was sharper than ever. It was a bright, clear Tuesday morning when Alice and I stood in the lobby of my old architectural firm. The space was bustling with activity, but the energy was different now. We were there for a press conference. I stepped up to the podium, leaning slightly on my cane, looking out at the gathered reporters and standing proudly in the front row, Sylvia. For 30 years, I have built physical structures designed to weather storms. I spoke into the microphones, my voice strong and steady. But recent events in my personal life taught me that the most important structures we build are not made of glass and steel, but of opportunity and integrity. I smiled, gesturing to a large, veiled placard beside the podium. Today, I am officially launching the Arthur Foundation, I announced as Alice pulled the veil away, revealing a beautiful, modern logo. Funded by a previously undisclosed private trust, this foundation will operate with an initial endowment of $40 million. Its sole purpose is to provide full-ride scholarships, mentorship, and legal advocacy for brilliant young women entering the fields of architecture and structural engineering. Women who need a foundation of their own. The cameras flashed, the room breaking into applause. I looked at Sylvia, who was beaming, clapping her hands, her eyes shining with genuine pride. Later that evening, I sat on the back patio of my lake house, the one Michael had so desperately wanted to liquidate. The sun was setting, casting a golden, fiery glow over the water. The air was peaceful. I had survived the collision of metal and glass on the highway, and I had survived the collision of greed and betrayal within my own family. Michael was sitting in a concrete cell, a prisoner of his own corrupted design. Sylvia was thriving, learning the true value of hard work and unshakable loyalty. And I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling the solid, unyielding earth beneath my feet. I had torn down a rotten structure, cleared the debris, and built something beautiful and enduring in its place. The trap had worked perfectly, but the true victory wasn't the revenge. It was the peace that followed. The foundation was finally secure.